A couple of years ago, an American friend of mine introduced me to the idea of having a life verse. Now, a life verse is when you pick a verse out of the Bible that you think best sums up your life. Well, after giving it some thought, I concluded that mine would have to be John chapter 6, verse 68. It comes after Jesus asked his own disciples as to whether or not they still want to be his disciples. And Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, to whom else would we go to? You have the words to eternal life." Peter's confession comes at the tail end of a series of events that begins right at the start of chapter 6. John tells us that there were throngs of people eagerly coming to hear Jesus speak, and they were especially attracted by all the many miracles he was performing. And on one particular occasion, apparently they were all so caught up in the moment that they forgot to pack a lunch, except a young boy who had a couple fish and some bread. Yet Jesus used that boy's lunch and miraculously multiplied it and fed every single person present. And we're talking thousands of people. Well, this just sent the crowds crazy. And in verse 15, John actually says that they wanted to take Jesus by force and make him their king. Well, Jesus caught wind of this and he made himself scarce. And then, under the cover of darkness, he and his disciples got into a boat and made a beeline to the other side of the lake. Well, next morning, the crowds put two and two together, and so they got into any boat that they could find. Now, to you and I, they would seem like a very committed bunch. Here were thousands of people who were willing to overcome any physical obstacle in order to hear Jesus speak. And yet Jesus knew that these people, well, they weren't really interested in him, but rather more in what they thought they could get out of him. And so Jesus begins to do something that is so completely counter to what we would do today in our seeker-friendly churches. Jesus deliberately begins to try to thin out the ranks. He preaches a message that he knew would be upsetting, that would expose the motives of these people's hearts. And sure enough, that's what happened. These same people who only hours before had been jumping on anything that could float in order to hear Jesus speak, now simply turned their backs on him and walked away. And it is at that point that Peter makes his confession. So why is Peter's confession my life verse? Well, I grew up in a Christian home. I went off to Bible college. I was even involved in ministry for a few short years. And yet, for a brief period of time in my mid-30s, I was just like one of those people. I walked away from Christ. In fact, I became an atheist. Now, the popular narrative that many atheists hold these days is that science can prove that there is no God. And yet that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what science is even capable of. Claiming that science can prove that there is no God is no different than claiming that you could mount an expedition to the Sahara Desert and it will prove that whales don't exist. Science is the study of the natural realm around us, and it is completely agnostic to the whole issue of whether or not God exists. And yet so many atheists believe that their views are scientific, when in fact they're purely metaphysical. Yet that was the narrative that I bought into. But it wasn't long before my case for atheism, which I thought was rock solid, quickly began to crumble. Now, I don't have time to get into all that right now. If you want to hear more about that story, please watch my video called Why I Was an Atheist. And at the end of this video, I'll provide a link somewhere around in order for you to see that. But to make a long story short, I became disillusioned with my atheism, and I came to the same realization as Peter. Lord, to whom else is there to go? You have the words to eternal life. So now comes the hard part, the application. What does all this mean for you and I? Well, let me ask you this question. Who best represents your life? That crowd or Peter? But let me quickly point out that Peter's motives weren't exactly pure all the time either. All you have to do is read the rest of John and the other three Gospels to know that Peter and the other disciples, well, at times they had ulterior motives. But what separated Peter from that crowd was that Peter did have a genuine desire in the midst of his selfishness and sinfulness to do the will of God. And I don't know about you, but I find that very encouraging. So what is your life verse and why? Let me know in the comments below. And if you feel that I've earned your subscription, then please click on the subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep searching.